Another Cosmos DeFi video here. This one is on the topic of impermanent loss. I'm going to discuss an experiment I did related to impermanent loss. And if you don't already know, impermanent loss refers to the change in number of tokens that were supplied to a liquidity pool due to the automatic balancing of that pool back to a 1-to-1 ratio. So when you supply liquidity, usually it's a pair of tokens. And initially when you set up the liquidity, if token A, token B, they have to be of equal value. But those prices change over time. So in order to maintain that equal value, 50-50 or 1-to-1 ratio, the amount of each token is going to change basically in real time. And I know this can result in an undesired effect for liquidity providers, but I do think people overestimate the effect of impermanent loss on their holdings. So I ran this simple experiment. I used pool number 642 on Osmosis Zone, and I chose this pool because it was not incentivized. It did have very high transaction volume and a small amount of liquidity, but the fact that it wasn't incentivized made it easier for me to track what was happening in the pool. And I also wanted to pick a stablecoin pool. UST maintains a $1 price, and this would give me one less variable to track. And this pool was perfect. The experiment lasted 5 days, and because of the pool that I took, I feel like it was 5 days was enough to see some significant information. Here's a snapshot of day one, and you could see my initial liquidity provided was $567. On the top left, you could see the pool. The total liquidity in the pool was over 20,000. It's a very small pool, relatively speaking, to some of the others. And part of that reason is because UMEE is a new project. A lot of people probably don't even know about it. UMEE was also not airdropped the way some of the other Cosmos-related tokens were. And I have about 3% of the liquidity in this pool. Actually, when I provided liquidity, I provided it as a single asset, and I shifted the price just by inserting this $500. Down at the bottom, you can see that 50% of the pool is made up of UMEE, 50% UST. This is the 50-50 or 1-to-1 balance that I was referring to earlier. And all the way at the bottom, you could see my amount of UMEE is 1,087 UMEE tokens, and its equal counterpart is 288 UST. Now, on the day that I supplied liquidity, UMEE's price was 26 cents. And I made a couple of assumptions. And assumption number one was that there would be high volatility in the UMEE price. I just assumed that it's a new project, not that many people know about it. The people that were trading it could be, highly bullish on the project because they've been following it. The project launched recently. Now they're kind of diving into the coin. Other people might have bought it and then see the price move and then dump it. So I assumed high volatility. I also assumed that the transaction volume would remain high versus the pool size. On the day that I supplied liquidity, the transaction volume was over $1 million. And for a $20,000 pool, this is a huge difference. I also assumed that for every 10% change in price, I would see a 5% change in the number of tokens. I was just estimating what I thought I would see here. And due to the high transaction volume, I assumed that the fees would be significant in a short amount of time. And these assumptions are what allowed me to run the experiment for only 5 days. Now, this is the chart of UMEE versus USD, and you could see I was right about the volatility. I didn't think it would dump almost 40%, but that's exactly what happened. The blue arrow on the left is where I inserted my liquidity. The blue arrow on the right is the end of my 5-day experiment, and you could see it's basically a 38% loss, 39% loss. Here is a screenshot of my liquidity after 5 days. You could see that I did lose some money, but nowhere near the 40% hit that UMEE token took. And despite this uneven trading where more people were selling than buying, you can see the pool remains at a 50-50 ratio. But this doesn't tell the whole story. So let's look at the before and after side by side. Day one is on the left, day 5 is on the right. You could see my liquidity did go down, and UMEE token did change significantly in price, roughly 40%, as we mentioned earlier. Now, on day 5, the pool size was actually 3.5 times or almost 4 times greater than it was on day one. And the transaction volume went from about 1 million down to about 300,000. Now, look, this is still a really high transaction volume for a pool so small, but it's not an ideal situation for a liquidity provider. In fact, I probably made more money in the first 24 hours through fees than the following 4 days. But that's okay. This is research, right? And actually, due to this volume, over a 7-day period, this pool generated about $9,000 in fees. And I had a piece of that for 5 of those 7 days. Let's look at what would happen if I pulled my liquidity right now. So if I pulled liquidity right now, I would have about 450 more UMEE tokens, but at a price significantly lower, right? 10 cents lower, which is about 39%. My number of UMEE tokens increased by 40%, and this was to maintain the 50-50 ratio. My number of UST tokens decreased by 11%, and I would have thought that would be greater, but I know that the fees collected did play a role here. My total liquidity decreased $45, roughly 8%, which really compared to the 40% loss on the UMEE tokens, it's not so bad. So let's look at what would happen if I didn't enter this liquidity pool. First, my number of UMEE tokens would be the same. I would have, the 1,088 tokens, but I would have lost 39% on those. It would have been roughly a $100 loss. However, I wouldn't have lost those UST tokens. Remember, I lost about 32. I think it was 32. And that you could look at as a $32 gain by not supplying liquidity. So the difference there, $68 is what I would have actually lost, not the 100 in just the UMEE tokens alone. That's an incomplete picture of what happened. All right, so some takeaways from this little experiment. The transaction fees definitely mitigate impermanent loss to an extent. I saw an exaggerated effect because the pool that I chose, the transaction volume was enormous compared to the size of the pool. And I did that on purpose so that I didn't have to run this experiment for months. It's actually possible to lose more money staking than with impermanent loss alone. So on Twitter, I know people talk about impermanent loss, and it looks like some people do avoid DeFi applications because they're worried about impermanent loss, but you could lose more money staking or just keeping your tokens on an exchange. And that's one of the things that was demonstrated in this experiment. Third thing, you could still make money even if pools are not incentivized. I definitely collected a significant amount of fees due to the high transaction volume. And number 4, you don't have to lock up tokens to make money. On Osmosis Zone, they give the option to lock up tokens for 14 days, 7 or 14 days, and you get extra rewards for doing that. You don't have to do that. If you're not comfortable locking up your tokens, you could find a pool like I did and try to put your tokens to work for you in a pool where you could withdraw your liquidity at any time. So let me know what you think about this experiment. Did I make a major error? Did I overlook something? That's possible. Or was it simple enough to generate some useful information about impermanent loss? What would you have done differently? You could let me know in the comments or on Twitter. Just please don't say that next time I should lose more money to make the video more interesting. I think this was a good enough experiment here. I did lose some money. And actually, I would appreciate it if you could thumbs up this video. If you learned something, follow me on Twitter and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much.